All right, happy Friday, everyone. Thank you for taking time out of your day to sit with me for, maybe roughly 35, 45 minutes to learn about anticipatory grief. Okay. This is one of those topics that I feel is important to revisit from time to time, especially as we have new caregivers coming onto the program and joining us on these Fridays. Um, but it's also a topic that can be a little hard to talk about, right? A lot of times our culture encourages us to avoid uncomfortable feelings, to avoid things like grief, sorrow, pain. And so bringing this topic to the foreground, I feel is very important. Um, and if it's something that we get into and it's a little bit too much for you, you're not ready for the information, that's perfectly okay for you to step away. These trainings are recorded and they are put on our YouTube channel and on our website, alabamarespite.org. So if you don't want to complete the training with me today, that's okay. The information will be available for you to either share or go through again as you are able to do so, okay? If you are interested in participating in our post survey, please put your email address into the chat. The post survey is just a few questions long. It's definitely not mandatory, but it is very useful for me to get your feedback, not only on this presentation today, but maybe some ideas for future presentations. As always, I am interested in what you all need. It makes my job a lot easier to know that I'm meeting those needs that you have. So if you want to jump in and give your 2 cents, just put your email address in the chat and I'll send you that survey after our time together today, okay? And so I did mention these are recorded, but after I give you the information, I will pause the recording and we will have a time to have conversation if you want to stick around for that, okay? All right, so there we go. Our agenda for today. We're going to define anticipatory grief. Some people have never even heard that phrase before, and so I want to define it as best as I can. I want to talk about the signs of anticipatory grief, right? Sometimes you don't even realize that's what you're experiencing. So I want to make sure that everyone's kind of on the same page on what it looks like and what it maybe it feels like, okay? Then we're going to talk about if there's any benefits to it and how we can work through anticipatory grief. And then I'm going to spend a little bit of time on unresolved grief symptoms and strategies, okay? So let's go ahead and get into it. So, what is anticipatory grief? So, anticipatory grief is a state of deep, painful sorrow that occurs before an impending loss. Okay, a lot of times we think about grief and we assume death, right? A loss of life. And that is very much part of it. But we can grieve a lot of different losses and not realize that we're experiencing grief. Okay, we might label it as disappointment or maybe even getting a knock to our self-esteem if we don't get something we're really hopeful for. But we can't experience grief for a myriad of reasons outside of the loss of a loved one, okay? But of course, that is sort of the context that we will be using the phrase grief today, okay? So anticipatory grief, it can affect people facing the impending death of a loved one or even their own death, right? A lot of you are caring for people who have a diagnosis that is terminal, right? And so they are processing all of that right alongside with you. And so the term is often used in context of death, but again, it can encompass any impending loss that's not related to death, okay? Anticipatory grief is common, okay? It's common among caregivers and your loved one that you're caring for, and often they happen at the same time, right? So it's a double whammy. You're managing your own grief and loss symptoms while also trying to comfort and care for your loved one at the same time. And that can be very, very complex, right? Anticipatory grief is more than just normal grieving that starts early, okay? It's often regarded as a means to process and resolve issues that are related to a dying person or a life-changing event. And it may provide you with the means to kind of proactively address your feelings, to kind of acquaint yourself to the consequences of the loss and maybe dealing with them now rather than after the fact. But of course, with any grief reaction, there's really no set amount of time that a person will grieve, right? There's no set amount of time, like, well, it's been 6 months, you should be good, or it's been a year, you should be good, right? And a lot of times people have these, kind of arbitrary timelines of what grief is supposed to look like. And we'll get into that a little bit more. But experiencing anticipatory grief before the death of a loved one, it does not mean that the grief after the loss will be less. Okay, so you don't have this finite amount of grief and you're going to do half of it now and half of it later. Okay, they're two separate experiences. Okay, I mean they're obviously interwoven, but grieving early does not necessarily mitigate the grief you're going to feel after the loss. Okay. And every relationship, of course, is as unique as the individuals themselves. And so grieving will always be distinct to that special tie that you have with that person. Okay. So we're going to do a little side by side here. Anticipatory grief versus grief after death. What are the differences? Okay. Well, anticipatory grief is very similar to what we would call conventional grief that we experience after the death. Because they both involve many of the same emotions. But with conventional grief, the emotions you're going to experience are the direct consequence of a loss, right? But anticipatory grief, of course, is the grief that you expect to experience, and much of which is kind of conceptual and can change over time, okay? We're just kind of projecting into the future, right? A little bit here. And anticipatory grief is sometimes described as a roller coaster, right? Because you can shift back and forth between feelings of distress for several days and then feelings of normalcy for a couple of days, right? Or of course, conventional grief, it's like you maybe have better days, and you have maybe some worse days, but you're still kind of in that constant space of grief, right? Anticipatory can be a little bit more tricky because some days you're feeling the grief and you're aware of the reality. And then other days, it doesn't cross your mind, right? So it can be kind of tricky. And there also may be part of you that's kind of clinging to the hope that maybe the diagnosis is wrong. And it can kind of buoy you at one moment and trigger intense anxiety at another. Okay, so there's a lot of complex emotions that can come into play here. And with conventional grief, your emotions and your actions are reactive, right? This happened, so I'm behaving this way. Okay. But with anticipatory grief, your emotions and actions are largely proactive, okay, which means this is going to happen, and so I'm behaving this way, okay? So again, they could feel very similar, but the nature of them are a little different. So what are the symptoms of anticipatory grief? And I feel like this is very important because, like I said before, there's a lot of people who are not aware that the feelings that they are feeling are associated with grief, okay? And if you don't know that, guess what? That's kind of an invitation for shame, right? I shouldn't feel this way. Why am I feeling so irritable? Blah, 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 right? So let's map out some of the symptoms of anticipatory grief. And if you see yourself in these symptoms, please know this is normal, okay? It's normal to experience grief prior to a loss. And so I don't want you to feel ashamed or beat yourself up for these feelings if this is what you are experiencing, okay? So the first one, loss of control of your emotions. Okay, so this can include intense sadness and tearfulness that comes out of nowhere or is easily triggered, right? Think about maybe like the holidays. Okay, this could be mom's last Christmas with us, right? And so you might kind of have that little moment of grief, even though mom is literally in the kitchen with you, right? So it can be kind of strange to pinpoint that as grief. Next, fear, irritability, anger. Okay. So beyond the fear of death, you may fear changes that will follow a death, right? Especially if you think about if you've been a caregiver for years and years and years, right? Decades or longer. It's part of your identity in a lot of ways, right? It's part of who you are. And so then when you're not caregiving anymore, when that journey has ended and that role is no longer how you identify yourself, there could be some fear around, well, who am I now that I'm not caring for this person? Okay. And I would kind of liken it to maybe like empty nesters, right? Where they've been caring for their child their whole life, and then the child moves away. Then what do? Who are they then? Okay. So it's kind of similar, of course, very different, but it's kind of like that, that fear of who am I after this event, right? After this moment of my life has shifted. In addition to dealing with your own anger, you may have to deal with the anger of the person you're caring for, right? Anger is one of those, hallmark stages of grief, right? I'm angry this is happening. This didn't have to happen to me. This didn't have to happen to my family and my loved one, right? And so there can be some very natural feelings of anger that come up, even prior to the loss of your loved one, okay? Loneliness and isolation, okay? It's not uncommon for caregivers to experience other people in their circle kind of backing away during serious health crisis. A lot of people don't know what to do and they feel uncomfortable, they feel in the way. And so they just kind of distance themselves. Okay. They're not trying to be cruel. I'm sure there's some people who are, but most people aren't trying to be cruel. They just don't know where to go and what to do with it. And so they just kind of disengage, right? But on the other hand, caregivers with anticipatory anxiety will often feel lethargic and unmotivated and will kind of withdraw themselves, right? So maybe it's not people distancing themselves from you, maybe it's you distancing yourself from your people, okay? And that can just contribute to that loneliness and that isolation. Next, anxiety, okay? Anxiety is kind of part of the job for a lot of you anyway. But if you are experiencing anticipatory grief, it can exacerbate or increase that anxiety. Okay. It's not uncommon for caregivers to feel like you're living in a state of heightened anxiety. And this can manifest as trembling, maybe being on edge all the time, having a racing heart, other symptoms like not being able to sleep well, maybe a shift in your appetite. Okay. Next is guilt. Okay, again, guilt can be something you feel whether you are experiencing anticipatory grief or not. Okay, but this definitely can be part of the mix, right? Feelings of guilt can occur if you want your loved one to be free of pain, even if that means they die. Okay, and that's a very hard, sticky, tricky place to be in, right? Where it's like, I don't want to see my loved one suffer, but I also don't want them to leave, right? And so how do you deal with that? How do you make sense of that feeling, right? It can be very, very difficult. Or you may feel the opposite, right? You want your loved one to stay even if it means that they're suffering. And that could be a hard one too, right? So that's those feelings of guilt can be very tricky. Next, maybe you have an intense preoccupation with your loved one who's dying, right? So this can occur to the point of fixation, right? Or obsessive compulsive kind of behavior, right? And this can make it very difficult for you to manage your own health and your own day-to-day things, right? Going to work if you're very preoccupied with your loved one. I can't leave them because what if something happens while I'm away, right? So that can be another sign of that anticipatory grief. And then the last one I'm going to go over is rehearsal of the death. So you may be visualizing what would it be like for you without your loved one there. And I'm not saying that that's a wrong thing or bad thing. And a lot of people do that. Okay, well, what happens? That kind of seems like a normal progression of your thought, right? Well, when this happens, what's that going to be like? Okay, so we can kind of play those scenarios and rehearse that in our mind. And you may be imagining how you and other loved ones will carry on once they're gone. Okay, so these are all very normal feelings, albeit some of them can be very uncomfortable, right? And we want to avoid them or we don't want to admit that we're feeling these things, but they're very, very normal. Okay, and I think it's important that you know that. So, are there any benefits to anticipatory grief, right? There are experts called bereavement experts, and they kind of have a consensus that anticipatory grief can have some benefits. Okay. Studies, of course, are conflicted because that's the nature of studies in a lot of ways, but they're on whether anticipatory grief is beneficial or not. But it appears to be on an individual basis, right? Some people find a lot of benefits to it, and some people don't. Okay. For some, it may help them sort out their feelings and kind of prepare for moving forward. It could help them confront their fears rather than avoid them, right? especially if you're rehearsing the death or you're analyzing your guilt or your anxiety about it, right? It can kind of be helpful to kind of do some self-reflection during this time. It can give you an opportunity to deal with any unfinished business, right? Both practical and emotional, right? Maybe there's that moment where you don't want to leave things left unsaid. And so you know your loved one is going to pass. And so you can make the most of that time you have. Whereas, someone who dies suddenly or unexpectedly, you don't always get that opportunity. Okay. So that could be what we consider maybe possibly a benefit, right? That you have that time to tie up those loose ends, to deal with that unfinished business. Okay, it can help clarify any misunderstanding or express what could have been said earlier. Saying your goodbyes, it could help you prepare for your life moving forward. Okay, and by doing this, it can help a person feel less distress and be able to better navigate their bereavement or their grief when their loved one does die. Okay. For other people, though, anticipatory grief may only serve as a prelude to conventional grief, right? And that can neither bolster that person for the harsh reality of their loss or prepare them for the life ahead, right? It could just be an early start to a very difficult and complex grieving process, and it doesn't really mitigate any of those symptoms at all, okay? According to the American Psychiatric Association, between 7 and 10% of grieving adults meet the criteria for something we call prolonged grief disorder. Okay. Some studies have shown that anticipatory grief can be like holding your breath until the real pain begins, right? And so it's not really making it easier for them at all. Okay. So prolonged grief disorder is a diagnosable thing. And here's a few of the symptoms. Feeling like part of yourself has died, okay? That it wasn't just your loved one who died that day, it was part of you that died as well, okay? A sense of disbelief about the death, avoidance of anything that reminds you about the death, right? Maybe it's more difficult to engage with friends or pursuing your own interest or planning for the future because you just kind of feel stuck in that kind of limbo moment. Feeling numb emotionally, feeling that your life is meaningless now, or feeling alone or detached from others. Now, I do want to say these symptoms by themselves are very normal for a healthy, typical grieving process, okay? But they are temporary. Prolonged grief disorder, when you have these symptoms for 6 months or longer after your loved one has passed away, okay? So if you're still in this kind of rut and you're in this loop, not saying that you have to be completely clear of all your grief at 6 months, because that's not the way grief works, right? Grief doesn't really go away, just kind of changes shape or gets a little bit more tolerable over time. But if you are kind of stuck in that moment, right, where you are feeling it just as intensely 6 months after the day it happened, it may be an indicator that you have prolonged grief disorder, okay? So I want to share with you 5 ways that you can work through anticipatory grief, okay? The goal here is to not remove the feelings from your life, okay? We don't want to ignore or kind of paint over or sweep under the rug these kind of feelings. We want to be aware of them, let them move through us naturally, and find ways to cope and adapt that are healthy for us, okay? So the first one, allow feelings of grief to help you prepare. So again, take time to examine unresolved issues between you and your loved one if there are any, okay? Say what needs to be said. And if your family member is still well enough, maybe go through some legal or financial matters, discuss end of life wishes, right? So that they can have as much say in that transition as they can, right? It can be very, very meaningful for somebody who is going through the dying process to have autonomy in that space as well. Okay. We have all kinds of plans for all these other milestones in our life, right? You know, graduation, birthdays, you know, a lot of mothers have birthing plans, right? Planning weddings, baptisms, right? All these things that we have these traditions around, and we have this input on how we're going to honor and mark something that's, you know, that means something in our lives. Death shouldn't be any different. Okay. We don't like to think about it, but it can really bring a lot of honor to somebody to know that you are going to respect their dying wishes. Okay. Next, educate yourself about what to expect. Okay. Some of you are caring for people with very complex medical diagnoses. A lot of you are caring for people who have cognitive decline, and you're not really sure what that is going to look like, right? And so when something happens, it can be very easy to be kind of knocked out of balance because you weren't expecting that to happen, right? So learn about your loved one's condition, know the symptoms, side effects of any treatments, and the prognosis. Understanding what's coming down the pike might help you to feel like you're in control, okay? And having a sense of control in a situation that you really can't control can be very, very helpful for you as you work through your grief, okay? Talk to somebody who is also feeling anticipatory grief, okay? We as humans are communal creatures. We have these little things in our brain that we call mirror neurons, okay, which allows us to feel empathy and to co-regulate with one another, okay? So talking to somebody who has either gone through what you're going through or is side by side with you in this can be very, very healing and be a great way to support yourself through this time, okay? Finding support groups of people who are experiencing the same thing. So online, in person, over the phone. There's a lot of Facebook groups. Social media can be a great resource for that because someone in a similar situation can provide a lot of insight, right? And it's okay to be honest about your feelings. And if you know somebody is walking the same path or a similar path, you know, they're feeling the same feelings too, or something close to it. And so you don't feel so odd or strange or out of place. Okay. And you're not being disrespectful to your loved one if you express some of these feelings, right? Of course, you don't want to just, you know, berate and mope and complain to your loved one who's dying, but to let them know, like, hey, you know, this is scary for me, or this is frustrating, or, you know, I'm kind of feeling lost here, right? You can have those conversations. Next, enlist help and continue to live your life. Okay, this one can be hard. When you know somebody is going to be here for a limited time, it can feel very, very selfish internally to go and do something to take care of yourself, right? But please know that this can be, it probably will be one of the hardest moments of your life. And if you need to take some respite during this time, that's perfectly okay. All right. Reach out to family and friends or hire somebody to help with the care of your loved one. Don't put your life on hold, okay? Meet with friends and try to have fun when you can. In the long run, it'll help you and your loved one, okay? You'll have more energy to care for them and do what you need to do towards the end, okay? Even if it's towards the end, you are still at a high risk for burnout, okay? And the death of your loved one isn't the end, right? It can definitely be the beginning of another segment of life that's very stressful, right? The funeral planning and the getting the will together and settling all the final accounts and meeting with all the people and family and friends that are going to come. I mean, that requires a lot of energy and it requires a lot of mental clarity. And doing that while you're grieving is already going to be hard. But doing that while you're grieving and burned out is nearly impossible, right? So take that respite, even if you know your loved one's time is at hand, okay? Within reason, of course. We're not saying go to the Bahamas for 6 weeks, right? You know, within reason, go have coffee, go take a walk, whatever, okay? And then finally, create moments your family member can enjoy, your loved one can enjoy. Okay. Even though your loved one is no longer able to participate in activities in the same way that they did before, they can still enjoy pleasurable activities with you. Okay. Find out what you can still do with your loved one and make that a priority. Okay. Take mom outside for some fresh air, play the music that they love. Do simple puzzles if they're able to do it, right? These moments might be what you cherish the most. Okay. And if you think about it, a lot of these ways to work through anticipatory grief involve community, right? They involve still doing the things that bring you joy and bring you pleasure. Okay. You can be sad, right? And you can feel anger and frustration and grief and all those things, and still have moments where you are happy, right? That you're enjoying yourself. Humans are very complex. We are not static creatures, and it's not uncommon to feel two things at once, right? Intense grief and also really sweet joy in that grief. Okay. So don't feel like you're dishonoring somebody by enjoying time, even though you're sad. Okay. All right. Talk a little bit about unresolved grief. Okay. So healthy grief is what we experience when we allow ourselves to feel the pain of our loss. Okay. It's uncomfortable, it's painful. We don't like to feel it, but it's healthy when we let ourselves feel those feelings. Okay. Taking time to identify and understand what we're feeling, and over time coming to accept what has happened, can be very, very helpful. Okay. Even though we never lose the pain of missing that person, right? We're still able to continue living and experience happiness, right? As humans, we live through our intellect, right? We plan our actions and our reactions, but grief is not an intellectual reaction, okay? It's an emotional one. And so we can't think ourselves through grief, right? Well, it's been this amount of time, I'm done, I'm just going to cut it off, right? That doesn't happen. We have to experience it, okay? We need to climb into that roller coaster and just let it go, right? And it is okay to hurt and it's okay to lose your way. But a lot of times in our culture, like I said before, grief can make people uncomfortable. And so we often kind of just ignore it or suck it up or pretend we don't feel it because other people in our space don't know what to do with it. And so we try to do the polite thing and get over it or talk ourselves out of it. And that can lead to unresolved grief because we never let the flow until it was done. We just kind of dammed it up, right? So telling yourself that you're fine when you're not, that just buries that pain deeper, while you try to carry on as normal. Okay. You might even tell yourself that you'll be okay in 2 years, right? Because maybe that's what somebody told you. It takes 2 years to get over losing someone that you love. But that's not true. Okay. If you don't do anything, you just get used to bearing the pain and you build your life around it, right? So you can say, if it only takes 2 years to get over grief, I'm going to ignore it for 2 years and then I don't ever have to process it or face it. It'll just go away. No, you never started the grieving process. So once you start it, it might take 2 years or longer, but never starting it never resolves it. So you're kind of stuck in this loop. Okay. Let's see. So we can no more control grief than we can predict it. But it is much easier to bear your sadness if you're also not beating yourself up for being sad, right? Again, we live in a culture that seeks easy and instant results to everything. So it's important that we learn that there's beauty and benefit and patience and effort and perseverance when we experience emotional trauma. Okay. One more slide. How do we complete the grief process? Okay. This is kind of tricky because you're never not going to grieve your loved one. Okay. You're never not going to feel sad that they're gone. It may be tolerable. You may be able to accept it and resolve that grief, right? but it's kind of always going to be there. So when I say completing the grief process, I'm meaning from like a clinical perspective. Okay, I'm not necessarily speaking about, you're going to go through this 6-week program and then you're never going to feel another sad thing about your loved one ever again. That's unrealistic. That's not how humans work. Okay, so completing the grief process is just to a point where you can accept it and still live a full life beyond the grief. Okay, it doesn't mean that you just forget that it hurt so bad. Okay. So getting closure. Okay. That's an effective way of completing this process. And one way that we can get closure, we can write out our thoughts. We can talk with other loved ones or friends about the loss. One thing I hear a lot with people who are grieving is nobody wants to talk about my loved one anymore. They just want to ignore it. It's like they never even existed, right? That's not helpful. So if you don't have someone that you can talk to about it, maybe try journaling, okay, writing it out, even calling a helpline, right? Sometimes people think, well, that's just for crises. You know what I'm trying to say. And some of them are, but a lot of them are really just about, hey, I need to talk to somebody. I need a warm body on the other end of this phone that is compassionate, that can hear what I have to say. Okay, so that could be something you can consider as well. Next, move toward what you might be avoiding. Yikes, right? Why would you want to move towards something that you're avoiding? Why would you want to move towards something that hurts, right? Because it helps, okay? Visit the grave site, especially if you've been finding excuses to avoid it, okay? And not everybody needs to do that, okay? There's no surefire way to grieve or complete the grieving process. But when we avoid things like that, we're essentially avoiding the uncomfortable feelings that come along with grief. And when we avoid the feelings of grief, we're not going to be able to complete that grief process. Okay, we're just going to find other more creative and clever ways to distract ourselves as our maladaptive coping skills stop working, right? Change your patterns and behavior. Okay, so if you've fallen into bad patterns, you obviously want to change those. If we have anxiety-driven behaviors, pushing against those can help you feel more control and can kind of help you stop those negative cycles. And of course, if it seems too monumental, if you are at risk of hurting yourself or others, consider therapy. Okay? It's very difficult and it can often be tied to other issues. So it could be a good time to consult with a therapist, even if it's just for a little bit, okay? Because they'll challenge you, but they'll also support you, okay? It's a safe space for you to be, a messy human, okay? Grief is about you and your relationships with other people, and it helps to have other people with you while you grieve. And that goes for conventional grief, also anticipatory grief. Again, for some reason, our American culture is very much like, you don't want your life to make mine feel uncomfortable, right? And then we wonder why our communities are the way they are, right? But finding other people who understand where you're coming from can be a great starting point, right? Because not everybody is safe to be vulnerable around, and I get that. But try to find somebody, even if it's just one person, okay? So here's my contact information, my email address, and also my office phone number. So if you found yourself in this presentation and you are looking for some support, I can offer that to you, okay? I am a licensed therapist. I'm a social worker. And of course, I've been working with you lovely caregivers for going on 4 years now. And so I understand in a lot of ways what you're experiencing. And so if you want to talk, whether it's therapy or a care chat, okay, it doesn't have to be a long-term thing, please reach out, okay? If your loved one is experiencing some of these feelings, some of this anticipatory grief, and they need someone to talk to, we have another therapist on staff named Kendra, and she sees caregivers and she also sees care recipients, okay? She even sees children, okay, as long as they're over the age of 6, reach out, okay?